Our last speaker tonight is Bill Sherman. Bill is Head of Research at the Victoria and Albert Museum and Professor of Renaissance Studies at the University of York. His work is driven by a love of archives and other collections and an interest in how objects from the past have come down to us, what they've picked up on the way, and how they speak to us across the periods of time. He's published widely, and I'll leave him to tell us whether that's also wildly, as everybody else is publishing wildly, on the history of books and readers, the plays of Shakespeare and his contemporaries, the interface between word and image, and the relationship between knowledge and power. His books include Used Books, Marking Readers in Renaissance England, and John Dee, The Politics of Reading in the English Renaissance. So I think we're delighted to welcome you, Bill, and please add to the excellent talks tonight.
Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here. It's great to be back in an old haunt and with an old friend, Deb, and also with an old friend, Dee, because it's been quite a long time since I've worked on John Dee, and it feels really good to be thinking about him again. So I want, like my fellow speakers, to take you back in time in search of Dee's miraculous mind, but I don't want to go quite as far back. I only want to go back as far as 1977. So that's 25 years into the reign of the second Queen Elizabeth. And to mark that anniversary, British filmmaker Derek Jarman produced the film that would become one of the defining documents of the nascent punk movement. Jarman's anarchic Fantasia featured a cast of musicians, models, and dancers, and even a few actors, running riot through a post-imperial wasteland. Now, given Jubilee's prescient portrait of the Thatcher era and its memorable cameos by Adam Ant, Toyah Willcox, Susie and the Banshees, and many others, it's very easy to forget that the film actually takes place in the 16th century and not the 20th. The colorful pageant of life under Queen Elizabeth II is in fact presented as a vision of the distant future shown to Queen Elizabeth I. And the medium for this dark magic is none other than John Dee, played, as you can see, by Richard O'Brien, better known as the creator of the stage version of Rocky Horror Picture Show and presenter of the TV game show, The Crystal Maze. So here is the opening scene of the film. I've often wondered how many of the film's viewers left the theater during these opening minutes, convinced that they'd accidentally wandered into the wrong film. But fans of Jarman would, of course, not be thrown by his juxtaposition between the two Elizabethan ages, and by the end of his career, he had certainly established himself as the most backward-looking of Britain's avant-garde filmmakers. Jubilee may be his boldest experiment with multiple temporalities, but he would explore the Renaissance and its modern shadows time and again, pressing both Dee and Shakespeare into service as channels between past, present, and future. 1 year after Jubilee showed Dee conjuring up the spirit Ariel from Shakespeare's Tempest, invoking the long-standing association between Dee and the play's dramatic magician Prospero. Jarman produced an entire adaptation of Shakespeare's final play, with Heathcote Williams as Prospero carrying a staff crowned by a version of Dee's hieroglyphical monad, seen here on the cover of the published screenplay. And a decade later, inspired by the transcripts of Dee's Conversations with Angels, he created a cinematic rendition of Shakespeare's sonnets, read by Judi Dench, as it happens, called The Angelic Conversation. Now, in his 1991 memoir, Dancing Ledge, Jarman bridled at David Bowie's accusation that he was obsessed with black magic. "I've never been interested in it," he said. "While I have been reading Dee and Jung for the last 10 years, I find Aleister Crowley's work dull and tedious." And he confessed that he was interested in magic of a different kind. "Alchemy," he said, "according to the approach of Marcel Duchamp, interests me much more." Now, linking Duchamp and Dee may have been a step too far for most people, and certainly a move peculiar to Jarman, but he was by no means alone in choosing Dee as a magical vehicle of choice for progressive time travel. In his guise as cloak-wearing magus, stargazing astrologer, or book-collecting alchemist, he's long served as the English past's most familiar guide to the mysteries of the future. In the cinematic tradition, Peter Greenaway is perhaps Jarman's nearest example of someone who, when at their most experimental, is most likely to turn back to the modes and models of the Renaissance. But the success of this event here and the broader exhibition project of which it's part, which I have to say have genuinely surprised me. I mean, when Deb and I were first working on Dee, there was not this much interest in the man. And I've been involved in quite a few of the 400th anniversary events around Shakespeare, and none of them have had the buzz surrounding this particular exhibition or event. So all of that success suggests that Dee's hold on the popular imagination is possibly stronger than it's ever been. And the time has finally come, I think, for us to take a serious look at what it is that we all want from Dee. His scholarly stock has gone up and down, to be sure, but he has retained a peculiar power to speak to writers who turn to the past for new perspectives on where we find ourselves now and where it is that we think we're going. So over the last decade or so, Dee has featured prominently in a shocking number of novels, plays, and recently even operas depicting early modern culture, and objects associated with Dee have figured in some of the British Museum's biggest exhibitions, including the blockbuster shows on Queen Elizabeth and William Shakespeare. Now, according to British Museum curators Silke Ackerman and Louise Devoy, gallery talks and lectures on John Dee are regularly oversubscribed. We can add today's event. And visitors often request a viewing of the secret room containing Dee's divination tools. Of course, there is no such room, but at least 6 magical artifacts, traditionally thought to be Dee's, are on display in a case in the museum's Enlightenment Gallery. And judging by the number of amateur photos of them on the web, they're probably its most popular attraction. They tend to follow the museum in labeling these items as Dr. Dee's, a practice that turns out, as Ackerman and Devoy have discovered, to be seriously misleading. Now, there are 3 inscribed wax seals with talismanic functions, and they bear strong similarities to those described in Dee's consultations with angels, but the earliest reference to them comes from 1692, and we have no way of knowing whether or not they have any connection with Dee. There's a round mirror of polished obsidian, evidently of Mexican origin, with an accompanying case, and when Horace Walpole acquired the object in the late 18th century, he claimed that it was the very show stone used by Dee's scryer, Edward Kelly. But the European history curators have found, again, no evidence to support this and have retained it only because their colleagues in the Department of Ethnography already had 2 better examples in their collections. There's a gold disc inscribed with a diagram of the vision of 4 castles described in detail by Dee and Kelly in June 1584, but recent scrutiny has established that it was made in the middle of the 17th century, copied from the illustrations of the printed book that we saw before from 1659. And most important of all, there is a small crystal ball that provides an early example of the tool most closely associated with divination. This iconic object has appeared in countless artistic representations of Dee and has adorned the covers of several recent monographs and biographies. Now, while Dee's texts do indeed describe the use of a round glass in a frame, it's unlikely that this is the one he used, and current curators can find nothing more than wishful thinking behind their 19th century predecessor's designation of this specimen, which arrived with Hans Sloane's collection much, much later as Dr. Dee's crystal ball. Now, these sobering findings have been part of a wholesale reassessment of Dee that has left some of the magical objects and activities we now associate with him looking like back projections. But there's nothing wrong with back projections, and I no longer want to take so much umbrage at them. It has reminded us, I think, and maybe now more than ever, that the power of Dee and objects associated with him to give traditional grounding to alternative presents and possible futures has always been strong, even in the 18th century, even in the 19th century. It also points to some of the ways in which we now might want to square what we could consider a romantic attachment to Dee as a magus with what we know from scholarly hard work about his actual life and works. Few figures have more to teach us about the arts and sciences of futurology, from the mystical to the mathematical, during one of the most crucial moments in European culture, when past and future, after all, came together in genuinely new ways. And it's worth noting, hearkening back to my title, Back to the Future, that the very name Renaissance, renascence, is about rebirth. It's about a larger cultural movement that is very much a matter, and always a matter, of going back to the future. Now, recent scholarship has given us a new appreciation of the extent to which Dee's late experiments in angelology were framed by lifelong interests in both alchemy and eschatology. These fundamentally end-oriented approaches to the cosmic order informed the rhetoric, the belief, and the action of Dee, and inflected many of the appeals he made to his patrons. They permeate the holdings of his library, as we've heard already in Deb's talk in particular, and they would have been immediately apparent to visitors to his Mortlake house, which did indeed include Queen Elizabeth on several occasions, since his library room was connected to what he called an appendix practical, a fully stocked alchemical laboratory, and the whole complex was stuffed with optical instruments, astronomical instruments, and globes. Now, both alchemy and apocalypticism proceed from the premise that the world is moving through predetermined ages in a way that is natural and inevitable, and that can, given sufficient learning, investment, inspiration, and optimism, I think that you nailed it, Deb, with that, can be known and even manipulated. So the alchemist believes that the cycles of decay or improvement that mark the world's progress can be controlled within the laboratory to generate new sources of wealth or new kinds of health. The influence of the heavens have always to be taken into account, since it gives the future fixed contours and absolute limits, which at times are very pressing indeed, right around the corner. Dee's own projects at the English and Habsburg courts were often inspired by this prophetic sense, as Deb said, that cosmic changes were just around the corner, bringing conditions that favored particular rulers and specific projects. Now, there are several relevant cases in Dee's career, including Dee's dedication, once again, of the enigmatic treatise on the Monas Hieroglyphica, this single symbol that contains all other symbols, to Emperor Maximilian in 1564. Some 20 years later, he would claim that it had been a divinely inspired prophecy, bringing together the mystery of the four elements and the fourth letter of the alphabet, which was D, his name, to the glorification of Maximilian's son Rudolf, the fourth Habsburg emperor. But for our purposes, the most telling example comes late in 1582, when Dee is asked to help the English crown with reforming the future of time itself. That year, Pope Gregory XIII attempted to fix a single date for Easter and faced the problem that since the sun's annual orbit was shorter than the calendar year, over the course of the Christian centuries, a gap of some 10 days had opened up. So he decreed that they should be lopped off immediately to reset the ecclesiastical clock, and this produced an ideological and astronomical crisis at the European courts, as Protestant countries decided whether to defy papal authority, and scholars throughout Europe argued about the actual number of days the calendar had gone out of whack. So in December 1582, as Catholic countries were putting this new Gregorian calendar into effect, the Privy Council commissions a report by Dee. He acquired and summarized the latest works from the continent and processed decades of data recording the sun's height at the meridian in London. At the end of February 1583, he presented a 62-page document he called The Plain Discourse and Humble Advice for Our Gracious Queen Elizabeth, a treatise, of course, neither plain nor humble, featuring an illuminated title page, a hyperbolic prefatory poem, and some astonishingly bold claims. In what would be a familiar pattern throughout his life, he combines a mastery of classical and medieval precedent, practical scientific observation, and an appeal to divine inspiration. Dee concluded that exactly 11 days and 53 minutes needed to be removed according to a sensible plan for the transition that dropped a few days each month between May and November, keeping key dates for both church and law courts intact. and he urged Elizabeth to lead Europe into a truly universal calendar reform that would reunite Christendom. It would conform to the basic principles of this new Gregorian system, but it would do so in a more accurate fashion, and in the process, by chance, move the prime meridian from Rome to London. Now, for Dee and his supporters at court, that was a divinely ordained opportunity, since both angelic intelligence and astrological conjunction told him that 1583 would herald a new and probably final age, positioning Elizabeth as the last reforming empress. Not surprisingly, the government's conclusions were somewhat different. And after much wrangling between the Privy Council and the ecclesiastical authorities, England ended up following most of Protestant Europe in retaining the older Julian calendar, creating a long-standing discrepancy of 10 days between England and the continent. We were talking before about whether Dee would be in favor of the Brexit or not. And actually, this is some evidence we might want to hold for later discussion. But Dee's idea, at any rate, of establishing a global meridian in London would have to wait for several centuries. Now, Dee's advice in this case was framed by what the angels had told him about his and Elizabeth's place in the divine plan, but the proposal itself was eminently practical. And while there is no evidence that Elizabeth ever asked Dee to conjure heavenly spirits, we do know of several occasions where he was asked by her or her ministers to calculate the movements of heavenly bodies in order to determine an auspicious day for key events, including, as we heard, her own coronation in 1558. Now, events such as these were recorded in Dee's private diary, usually credited with being the very first. Now, as you can see here, it took the form of marginal entries, back to the marginalia, in a pair of astronomical almanacs. And it's interesting here that the almanac as a form is that crucial future-oriented textual form. The almanac used by Dee had a month-at-a-glance format, and this month, November 1577, was incredibly important, as the appearance of a portent in the shape of a comet, observed and interpreted throughout Europe and sketched by Dee in the upper left margin, might have led him to expect. So early in the month, he's visited by Sir Humphrey Gilbert, one of several leading explorers who turned to Dee for navigational training. And in the days following, the 22nd, he saw a flurry of activity at court. On the 22nd, he noted, "I rode to Windsor to the Queen's Majesty." 3 days later, "I spake with the Queen at 5 o'clock. He did so again 3 days later and also spoke with Master Secretary Walsingham, Secretary of State. A large note in the top margin on the facing page gives us some idea of what all the fuss was about. "I declared to the Queen, Q, her title to Greenland, Estotieland, and Friesland." Now, this is quite a different scene than the one depicted in Jarman's Jubilee, and it captures, I want to suggest, a very different John Dee. This is the Dee who is credited with coining the very term British Empire, and who certainly emerged as one of its earliest and most ingenious advocates, supporting both the search for new lands and the repossession of territories that once could be argued to have belonged to the British Crown, and matching the expeditions of seamen with his own exhaustive research in the library, where he had a huge section devoted to what the catalog called historical books pertaining to navigation. It's one of his biggest categories in his library. Dee gradually claimed for the Queen a vast imperial dominion covering most of the water and much of the land in the Northern Hemisphere. He put particular faith in the legendary exploits of a name we've seen in the margins already, King Arthur, and saw Elizabeth as poised to revive and surpass Arthur's territorial claims, particularly in the North Sea and North Atlantic, but eventually stretching throughout Northeast and Northwest Europe and across to America and Asia. Now, this was a bold vision for the future based on the past, and Dee's writings on the subject often struggle with the appropriate tense of this imperial outlook. And in a sense, what you're getting in that Derek Jarman scene is the person who's showing Elizabeth I the way to become the first empress over an empire that would never set, to the one who is seeing it basically fall apart. It's an extraordinary, poignant, if somewhat kitschy and campy scene. Now, this Dee had already had a reputation for magical knowledge, of course, but it was a different kind of expertise that led to these consultations, with Gilbert, Walsingham, and Elizabeth. Now, this copy from a book of from Dee's library, now at Archbishop Marsh's library in Dublin, has this interesting note by its subsequent owner that gives us a different label for Dee. This book did sometime belong unto Dr. John Dee, the great mathematician of our time. I did miss all his manuscripts most narrowly. Now, for many of Dee's contemporaries, he was first and foremost a mathematician, and an insistence finally on the preeminent value of number runs through his entire career. It's most visible in the landmark text he helped to produce, the first English translation of Euclid's Elements of Geometry, published by John Dee in 1570. For that edition, Dee produced what may have been his most accessible and influential text, this long preface, the so-called mathematical preface, on the supreme importance of mathematics for everyone from the most mechanical to the most mystical. Here's the opening page of that mathematical preface, and it shows one of Dee's cleverest textual contrivances, this initial D for divine Plato, that contains the rampant lion from his new coat of arms, along with his own monogram, a Greek delta, and again, the hieroglyphical monad. The text itself is a comprehensive account of the theory and practice of mathematics, culminating, whoops, you don't get it, easily found online, the ground plat of the mathematical preface, offering a schematic summary of the topics treated at length in the foregoing prose. The bulk of the outline, which folds out to contain it, lays out this list of sciences that depend on mathematics, and Dee's preface is famous for the attention it gives to practical applications in the most mundane activities. Dee clearly participates here as a leader in what has sometimes been called the mathematical renaissance, pointing to some of the developments that would have far-reaching implications for the management of the future in the 17th century in particular, particularly concerning the development of probability in the growth of insurance or in gambling or other ways in which we try to predict and control the unpredictable. So for Dee, finally, it offers a key to understanding the deepest nature of creation. And here he says, because God in the distinct creation of all creatures, in all their distinct parts, properties, natures, and virtues, by order and most absolute number, brought from nothing to the formality of their being, the mathematician has means to ascend and mount up with speculative wings and spirit to behold in the glass of creation the form of forms, the exemplar number of all things numerable, both visible and invisible, mortal and immortal, corporal and spiritual. So to conclude, the time may at last be right to move beyond a transhistorical interest in magic to consider the tools and techniques developed in the early modern period for knowing and managing the future. And here we might well find a place alongside the Dee who looks like Shakespeare's Prospero, for the one who looks maybe like a Jungian analyst, or even better, a Duchampian alchemist, a place that is for the figure who was the creator of Elizabethan England's largest library, the moving spirit behind the first English edition of Euclid, the keeper of Europe's first private diary, the coiner of the term British Empire, and last but not least, the inventor of Greenwich Mean Time. Thank you.
Bill, thank you so much. I mean, I think that the three talks together have brought so many different strands of Dee that I think the title, John Dee's Miraculous Mind, has really been adequately and very clearly and extensively brought together tonight in the talks. So thank you very much to our three speakers. Please join me in thanking all of them.